So a good way to think about the body without organs is that it's fairly similar to Foucault's idea of a discourse. Foucault, like other philosophers, is trying to decide exactly how subjects come about, how they come to be, and specifically how they come to have a determinate identity. So you could think about persons having various qualities that distinguish them as citizen or male or female or student or subordinate or voter or healthy, sick, mad, whatever it may be. And Foucault comes up with the idea of a discourse. And he says that to emerge as a subject, you must be filtered through a matrix, so to speak. You can think of this like a grid or like a grate in the road. It's got squares that only allow things of certain sizes to fit through and certain shapes. So like a stone that's too big or the wheel of a car won't go through it, but rainwater will, and small pieces of trash and whatnot. And Foucault says that this matrix is structured by power. So certain things will be allowed to have an identity in terms of whether or not or how they relate to the dominant power and the power structure, in a sense. So, for example, to be a woman, exactly what that means is defined through things like gender roles, which we can easily imagine power is going to structure what those roles are going to be. If you live in a society that is patriarchal, for example, your women are, by definition, going to serve a subservient role. They'll be the home builders or whatever, or it will be distasteful for them to have a job or whatnot. So this is a discourse. Power creates a discourse of what it means to be a subject at all. And one of the big problematics with Foucault is this discourse. You can never get behind a discourse because, in a sense, you have limitless possibilities for what exactly you can be as a subject. Because if you think about what does it mean to be a woman, in the sense of what does that mean to oneself, it could mean a multivariate and infinite number of things. Now, of course, we have certain ideas of what we think a woman is or ought to be, but these are structured by culture, of course. You know, that it's a little silly to say, oh, a woman should do this or that, and it's just on high. It's spoken on high. It has nothing to do with the facts of history or whatever it may be. It makes a lot more sense to say that a woman, exactly what it means to be a woman, how it feels to be a woman and things like this, is in fact structured by a discourse. Now, historically, this discourse has worked against women, and this brings into question the idea of how do these people that are written over by a discourse, who grow to inhabit a subaltern position of being this lowly term, how exactly does that agency come to be expressed? And this is a great problem because a discourse, you know, we can imagine if underneath a grate in the road, we're trying to collect certain items. Say we're trying to collect stones, and we roll a bunch of different sized and shaped stones over the grate. And of course, only stones that are sufficiently small and sufficiently uniform in their roundness, are going to be able to fit through. And we can imagine, maybe we just stumble upon, we've never seen rocks before, or stones, and we only see the stones that are filtered through that grate. Now we could say this is what stones are, but knowing that there's a grate above us, it would make more sense epistemically to say that in fact we don't actually know what stones are. We just know what is able to fit through this grate that we call stones. And as such, it gives us a great problem with knowledge, which is to say, how can we make any definite statements about the things that make it through a discourse that are allowed to have a voice in any respect, whether it's a subaltern or a dominant one? How can we make true claims about them when all that we have epistemic access to is that which makes it through? We could imagine there are much larger stones, or stones with a much greater diversity of shapes such that they wouldn't fit through the grate. And to say that the stones that just happen to make it through the grate or the matrix or the filter are the real stones, in terms of real being representing all possible stones, obviously that's not true. Only certain things are able to make it through. So, as such, this greatly problematizes making any certain claims to knowledge when all of the entities we have access to are given to us through a discourse, this grate that allows certain things to come through. Now, a way that a discourse is problematized is by Deleuze and Guattari. They want to talk about this thing called the body without organs, which basically imagines these flows in all these different positions, and these flows will interact with each other, whether this is flows of matter, flows of libido, flows of desire, flows of liquids, whatever it be. These flows will interact with each other and form entities. They call them partial objects. And the surface upon which these entities are inscribed is the body without organs. So in this sense, it's quite similar to a discourse. It's the thing upon which indeterminateness, a whole variety of things, become territorialized. And they start to gain shape and identity, but precisely because certain things are allowed to appear and certain things aren't. Now, the difference between the body without organs and a discourse is Foucault's idea of a discourse is a little bit more static, in the sense that Foucault, in his work, conceives of history as having these very definite moments, these definite periods of time where certain discourses reign on high, so to speak. For example, in Madness and Civilization, he's talking about what does madness mean, and he splits into specific periods how exactly madness is treated. And this presumes a certain stability in the power structure that is allowing certain things to come through. Now, of course, we can imagine things changing and different ways power is expressed is changing, but ultimately, Foucault thinks that we can kind of average things out, so to speak. Now, Deleuze and Guattari are a little bit different with the body without organs, because the body without organs is something we want to become, or we ought to become, or we should want to become. And the body without organs, is this surface upon which identities are inscribed, just like the discourse is the thing through which indeterminacy is filtered and turned into determinate identities. But the body without organs is not separate from the flows. If we imagine the grate in the road, like we did before, the kind of filter, the grate stands stable and is itself pre-discursive in a way. It is the foundation before identities are actually formed that allows identities to be formed in the first place. So the grate or the matrix or the discourse, whatever you want to call it, is very stable, and rocks and stones just happen to slip through it, and we start to gain knowledge through empirical and even non-empirical methods. Now, for Deleuze and Guattari, this is unfounded. They think that, in fact, the body without organs has a very visceral and very intimate relationship with the flows or the information that gets filtered through it. We've got all these flows interacting together, and they represent endless possibilities within a space. And the only possibilities that become actualities are those that result from the interaction with these flows on the body without organs. So in a sense, the body without organs gains its identity or its determinateness, what exactly it allows to come through, based on its relationship with the flows. And as such, the body without organs is constantly changing the way that it interacts with these flows and allows for the possibility of actual newness to come about. Because if we imagine the grate in the road that we had before with certain stones coming through it, our knowledge is limited precisely because we know exactly the discursive relationship between the stones that go through it and the properties of the grate. We know the size of the holes of the grate and the shape of the squares on the grate. So as such, we have a very definite idea about how our knowledge is limited by the discourse. But what happens if this discourse is also changing and constantly evolving in relationship to the flows which act upon it? Well, then it seems that we have a little bit more epistemic room, because in fact, things that weren't able to come out before, say a stone is too large that it doesn't fit through the grate. Before, in Foucault's idea of the discourse, those things would never come about. And as such, because discourses are definite, we can understand in abstract that certain things would never be able to be acquired as legitimate things of knowledge. And if they did eventually, it would only be because the discourse had changed and now new things were impossible. So in a sense, knowledge is always something we could never get behind. But with the idea of the body without organs, now we have a discourse which constantly has bred within it the possibility for newness to arise, precisely because the discursive relationship between the flows, between the stones that come through the grate or whatever we want, are always changing. We can alter our analogy by imagining now that the grate that is allowing certain stones to come through is constantly changing in response to the different stones that flow through it. We could imagine, maybe the grate is made of some sort of substance such that if a stone is too big and tries to fit through one of these square holes, it starts to stretch the substance of the grate and have this effect on it that compounds over time. And this compounding effect will mold and change the discourse, such that these pushes and pulls against the grate allow it to actually allow for new things through the resistance. And this is linked to Deleuze and Guattari's idea of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. Deterritorialization is trying to take these definite forms that are achieved through the flow's interaction with the body without organs and trying to decentralize them. Trying to say, okay, these things are not as definite as they seem. They are a product of these contingent relations, and they are in relation to a body without organs that is constantly evolving and changing. And through this act of deterritorialization, we come upon the possibility for a sort of revolution that is different. And they even talk about in Anti-Oedipus this relation to, for example, John Cage. And John Cage, in his essay For the Birds, for example, talks about certain ideas about randomness in musical composition, of trying to, instead of making music a discursive practice where we have definite pre-made relations to sound, we instead re-territorialize the discourse of music and add in random events, things that do not fit within the discourse or the body without organs, and thus alter and change it in this play of flows. So that is going to allow Deleuze and Guattari to actually talk about newness. Instead of this constraint upon knowledge that is achieved with Foucault, and is a great problematic that he very well knows. I mean, he wrote L'Archéologie du Savoir, the archaeology of knowledge. And he was very aware that these constraints upon knowledge are a great problematic for us to actually talk about accepting difference, when difference is always understood despotically. If you know anything about the despotic signifier, like I talked about in my last lecture, this is going to give very determinate constraints on the actual knowledge that we can come to. So here we can see that Deleuze and Guattari are going to allow for the potential for newness to come about precisely by playing with the ways in which indeterminacy, in which these infinite possibilities are translated into definite objects of knowledge. So I hope this gives some clarity on the idea of the body without organs, about territorialization and deterritorialization, about discourse, and maybe gives you a way into Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy. So that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.